The nurse was fired for theft, and the millionaire saw her ring, the same one his daughter wore before disappearing 20 years ago. The rain poured relentlessly over the sprawling Sullivan estate, casting an eerie grayness across its manicured lawns and marble walkways. Julia Carter stood at the grand entrance, clutching her worn canvas bag as her hands trembled. The security guards avoided her gaze, their expressions unreadable, but the weight of their presence was suffocating. She had never imagined this moment, being escorted out like a criminal from the place she had dedicated her life to with such care and devotion. "I trusted you, Julia." Edward Sullivan's voice echoed behind her, sharp and resolute, though laced with a tinge of something more complicated, perhaps regret or disbelief. "But there's no excuse for theft in my home." Julia turned, her chest heaving with indignation and disbelief. "Mr. Sullivan, I didn't take anything. You have to believe me, I would never—" Edward raised a hand to silence her. His eyes, cold and piercing, scanned her face for traces of deception, but he found none. Yet the evidence was damning. The missing bracelet, conveniently discovered in Julia's work locker, left little room for doubt. "This is not a discussion," Edward said curtly, brushing past her. "You can leave now." The guard stepped forward, signaling the end of her protest. Julia swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice cracking as she muttered, "I didn't do it. I didn't—" The heavy oak doors closed behind her with a resounding thud, leaving Julia standing in the pouring rain. Her world upended. The ride back to her modest apartment in the city felt surreal. Julia replayed every moment of the past week in her mind, searching for clues. Who could have planted the bracelet in her locker? Why would anyone want to sabotage her? She had always been a model employee, going above and beyond for the Sullivan family. As the city lights blurred past the rain-streaked windows of the cab, Julia's thoughts drifted to her late mother. Her mother had always said, "Your honesty is your greatest strength, Julia. Never compromise it, no matter what." The words felt like both a comfort and a curse. Now, when she finally reached her apartment, Julia collapsed onto the couch, staring at the peeling paint on the ceiling. Her mind was racing. But her exhaustion won. She drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of accusing eyes and locked doors. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, but Julia felt no warmth. She sat at her kitchen table, sorting through her belongings in a feeble attempt to distract herself. It was then that she noticed a small velvet box nestled among her things. Her heart skipped a beat. She opened it hesitantly, revealing a delicate gold ring with an intricate floral design. Her mother's ring. Julia's lips curled into a faint smile as she ran her fingers over the familiar pattern. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. The ring was all she had left of her mother, a token of their bond, and the only connection to a past that now felt impossibly distant. Meanwhile, back at the Sullivan estate, Edward sat in his private study, nursing a glass of bourbon. The accusation against Julia lingered in his mind, unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. Julia had been with the family for years, caring for his late wife during her final days and earning their trust with her dedication and compassion. Yet the evidence had been irrefutable. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. His sister, Janet Brooks, entered with her usual air of authority. "Still brooding over the nurse?" she asked, her tone laced with mild disdain. Edward didn't respond, instead swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Janet sighed and perched herself on the arm of his chair. "I told you hiring someone from her background was risky. You can't trust people who are desperate." Edward finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Desperate doesn't make someone dishonest, Janet. She was a good nurse." Janet shrugged, feigning indifference. Good intentions don't mean much when the evidence is against her. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a housekeeper, carrying a small box. "Mr. Sullivan, I found this while tidying up the attic," she said, placing it on the desk. Edward opened the box absent-mindedly, but as he peered inside, his breath caught. Resting on a velvet cushion was a ring, a delicate gold band with a floral design, identical to the one Julia had cherished. His mind raced as memories flooded back. It was Scarlett's ring, the very one she had been wearing the day she vanished 20 years ago. "Where did you find this?" Edward asked, his voice tight with urgency. "The attic," the housekeeper replied, confused by his reaction. Edward's pulse quickened. He stared at the ring, his thoughts spiraling. How had it ended up here after all these years? And why did Julia have something so similar? The questions gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. For the first time in years, Edward felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. Edward Sullivan sat in his study, the small gold ring resting in the palm of his hand. It was a delicate piece, its floral design as familiar to him as the back of his hand. The memories it carried, however, were anything but delicate. Scarlett, his daughter, the laughter that used to fill their home, her tiny hands clutching his as they walked through the gardens. It all came flooding back with a force that left him breathless. "Scarlett," he murmured under his breath, his voice heavy with a mix of longing and regret. It had been 2 decades since that terrible day, and Edward had done everything in his power to bury the pain. The official story was simple: a tragic accident during a family outing. But deep down, Edward had always known there were unanswered questions. And now, this ring, her ring, had surfaced out of nowhere, stirring a storm he thought had long passed. Janet's voice broke the silence. "Edward, are you going to sit there all night brooding over that ring?" He turned to see his sister leaning against the doorway, her arms crossed. She always carried herself with an air of control, a stark contrast to the turmoil he felt inside. "Where did this come from, Janet?" Edward demanded, holding up the ring. "This was Scarlett's. It shouldn't be here." Janet's expression tightened. "It's just a coincidence. Probably got mixed in with some old belongings during one of the estate renovations. Don't read too much into it." But Edward wasn't convinced. "And Julia? She had something nearly identical. Are you telling me that's just a coincidence too?" Janet's mouth opened, but no words came. For a fleeting moment, her composed facade cracked, revealing something akin to unease, but just as quickly, she recovered. "You're grasping at straws, Edward," she said, her voice sharp. "Julia is gone. Let it go." Edward's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right, and he intended to find out what. Across town, Julia sat in her tiny apartment, the gold ring her mother had given her now resting on the table. She had spent the last hour staring at it, her mind swimming with questions. It was the only heirloom her mother had ever passed down to her, and she had always cherished it. But now, after the events at the Sullivan mansion, she couldn't help but wonder if it held more significance than she'd been told. "Mom," she whispered, tracing the delicate floral design with her fingertip. "Why did you keep this so secret?" Julia's thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. It was her best friend, Maria. "Hey," Julia said, trying to mask the exhaustion in her voice. "I heard what happened," Maria said. "Maria," her tone a mix of sympathy and outrage. "I can't believe they accused you like that. Are you okay?" Julia hesitated. "I don't know. Everything just spiraled. One minute I was working and the next I was being escorted out like a criminal." "You didn't deserve that," Maria said firmly. "You've always been honest. They'll figure it out." "I don't think they care," Julia replied bitterly. "People like Edward Sullivan don't change their minds once they've made up their minds." Maria paused. "What about the ring? The one your mom gave you?" Julia frowned. "What about it?" "Well, isn't it kind of strange?" Maria asked. "I mean, they accused you of stealing, and now there's this connection to something from their family, maybe. Maybe there's more to it." Julia sighed. "I don't know, Maria. I just wish my mom were here. She'd know what to do." The conversation stayed with Julia long after Maria hung up. There was something about the ring, something her mother had never shared, and now it felt like the key to unraveling everything. Back at the mansion, Edward couldn't sleep. The ring sat on his desk, a symbol of all the questions he had avoided for 20 years. He thought about Julia, her vehement denial of the accusations, the tears in her eyes as she pleaded her innocence. It didn't sit right with him. Against his better judgment, Edward called his head of security, a man named Wallace who had worked for the family for years. "I need you to track down Julia Carter," Edward said without preamble. Wallace hesitated. "You fired her, sir. Are you sure?" Edward's voice hardened. "Just find her." The call ended, and Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. If Julia had the same ring as Scarlett, there had to be a connection, and if there was even a chance she was tied to his daughter, he needed to know. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Edward felt a spark of determination he hadn't felt in years. He had spent 2 decades haunted by what he'd lost. It was time to uncover the truth. The bustling sounds of the city filled Julia's small apartment as she prepared a modest breakfast. She tried to push the events of the last few days out of her mind, but the image of Edward Sullivan's piercing gaze haunted her. She could still hear his voice, full of disappointment and finality. As he accused her of theft, her chest tightened at the memory. Julia glanced at the gold ring resting on her table, the delicate floral design catching the morning light. It was the only tangible connection she had to her late mother, a reminder of the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her a better life. But now, the ring felt different, almost heavier. Its significance had shifted, leaving her with an unshakable sense of unease. As she sipped her coffee, a loud knock on the door startled her. Julia froze, her mind racing. It was too early for visitors. Setting her mug down, she cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. Her breath caught. 2 imposing men in dark suits stood outside, their expressions unreadable. Julia's heart pounded. These weren't ordinary visitors. "Miss Carter," one of the men called, his tone firm but not aggressive. "We need to speak with you. It's regarding Edward Sullivan." Julia hesitated. What could he possibly want now? Slowly, she unlocked the door, her voice trembling as she asked, "What is this about?" "We've been instructed to bring you back to Mr. Sullivan's estate," the man said. "He has some questions regarding a personal matter." Julia blinked, confusion and apprehension warring within her. "Why? He made it clear I wasn't welcome there." "I'm afraid we don't have all the details," the man replied. "But he insisted it was urgent." Julia crossed her arms. "And if I refuse?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're hoping you won't," Mr. Sullivan said. "It's important." Julia considered her options. She could slam the door and pretend this never happened, or she could face whatever awaited her and finally get some answers. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "But I'm not staying long." The car ride back to the Sullivan estate was tense and silent. Julia stared out the window, her thoughts spiraling. What could Edward possibly want with her now? The humiliation of her dismissal still stung, but curiosity outweighed her pride. The memory of the gold ring lingered in her mind, fueling her unease. When they arrived, Julia was ushered into Edward's study. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books that reeked of wealth and history. Edward sat behind a large mahogany desk, his expression unreadable. He held the gold ring in his hand, turning it over as if examining every detail. "Julia," he said, his voice softer than she expected. "Thank you for coming." She stood rigid, her arms crossed defensively. "I didn't have much of a choice." Edward gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit." Reluctantly, Julia complied, her eyes fixed on the ring in his hand. She decided to address the elephant in the room. "What's this about?" Edward placed the ring on the desk between them. "This ring, it belonged to my daughter, Scarlett. She wore it the day she disappeared." Julia's breath hitched. "Your daughter?" Edward nodded, his gaze heavy with emotion. "She was only 5 when we lost her, 20 years ago, during a family outing. This ring, it was hers. And yet, you have one exactly like it." Julia's throat tightened as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her own ring. She set it beside the one on the desk. The two were identical, down to the finest detail. Her voice was barely a whisper. "This was my mother's. She gave it to me before she passed." Edward's brow furrowed. "Your mother? Did she ever mention where she got it?" Julia shook her head. "No. She just said it was special and that I should take care of it." Edward leaned back, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "I need to know the truth, Julia. If there's even the slightest chance that you're connected to Scarlett, I have to know." Julia's heart raced. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need answers," Edward said firmly. "I want to run a DNA test." Julia's eyes widened. "A DNA test? You think I could be—" She trailed off, the enormity of his implication crashing down on her. Edward's tone softened. "I know it's a lot to take in, but please, Julia. I've spent 20 years not knowing what happened to my daughter. If there's a chance." Julia stared at him, her mind reeling. Part of her wanted to walk away, to leave the past buried. But another part, the part that had always yearned for answers about her own life, couldn't resist the pull of the truth. "Fine," she said finally. "Let's do the test." Later that evening, as Julia left the estate, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her. She glanced at the ring in her hand, its delicate design now a symbol of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The truth was coming, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. The Sullivan estate felt different when Julia returned a week later. The sprawling lawns and towering mansion were as pristine as ever. But there was an energy in the air, a tension that seemed to echo her own nerves. She clutched her coat tightly around herself as the security guard escorted her to Edward's study, where the answers she both dreaded and needed awaited. Edward stood by the large window, his silhouette framed by the afternoon light. He turned when Julia entered, holding an envelope in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that made Julia's stomach churn. "Julia," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Thank you for coming." She took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding. "I assume the results are in." He nodded and gestured for her to sit. She remained standing, her legs too tense to comply. Edward exhaled deeply, his gaze dropping to the envelope. "I want you to know, no matter what these results say, I appreciate your willingness to do this. It couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," Julia admitted, her voice tight. "But I need to know as much as you do." Edward carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the papers inside. The room was silent, save for the faint rustling of the paper and the ticking of an antique clock. Julia held her breath, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. When Edward finally looked up, his eyes were glassy. "The results are conclusive," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Julia, you're my daughter." The words hit her like a thunderclap. She staggered back a step, her mind racing to catch up with what she'd just heard. "What? That can't be." Edward crossed the room quickly, his movements uncharacteristically unsteady. He handed her the paper, the DNA analysis confirming their biological connection in stark black and white. Julia scanned the words, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered, shaking her head. "My mother, she never said anything. She would have told me." Edward's face softened. "Maybe she was trying to protect you, or maybe she thought it was too late." Julia's breath came in shallow gasps. "This doesn't make sense. My mother raised me. She loved me. Why would she hide this from me? From you?" Edward's jaw tightened. "I don't know, Julia, but I intend to find out." She looked up at him, her emotions a chaotic storm. "I can't just accept this. Everything I've ever known, my entire life, it's all a lie." "It's not a lie," Edward said gently. "It's complicated, but we'll figure it out, together." Julia sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she placed the paper on the desk. "I don't even know what to feel. Angry, confused, grateful." Edward crouched beside her, his expression earnest. "Feel whatever you need to feel. This is your journey as much as it is mine." The following days passed in a blur for Julia. She found herself oscillating between disbelief and cautious acceptance. The DNA test didn't lie, but the implications were overwhelming. How could she reconcile the life she had known with the one she had now inherited? Edward, for his part, was determined to mend the lost years. He invited Julia to the mansion daily, eager to share memories of Scarlett and give her a glimpse into the family she had been separated from for so long. At first, Julia resisted, but curiosity and a deep, unspoken longing eventually drew her in one afternoon, as they sat in the sunroom overlooking the estate's sprawling gardens. Edward shared a story that brought a rare smile to Julia's face. "Scarlett loved these gardens," he said, his voice warm with nostalgia. "She used to run through the flower beds, picking blooms for her mother. No matter how many times we told her not to, she'd always come back with a handful of crushed daisies and the biggest smile." Julia laughed softly, imagining the little girl she might have been. "I used to pick flowers for my mom too," she said, her voice tinged with wistfulness. "But it was usually weeds from the side of the road." Edward chuckled, though his smile faded quickly. "I miss so much, Julia, and for that, I'm sorry. I should have looked harder." "It's not your fault," Julia said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. "You didn't know." "I should have," he insisted, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you. But not everyone welcomed Julia with open arms. Janet, Edward's sister, remained cold and aloof, her disapproval evident in every glance and curt word. Julia couldn't understand why, but her gut told her Janet was hiding something. One evening, as Julia explored the mansion, she stumbled upon an old storage room filled with forgotten belongings. Among the dusty boxes, she found a framed photo of a young Edward with a little girl, Scarlett. The sight took her breath away. Her eyes lingered on the girl's face, searching for traces of herself in the delicate features. Beside the photo was a small locked box. Julia's curiosity got the better of her, and she brought it to Edward. When they opened it together, they found a single letter written in a familiar handwriting. It was from Julia's late mother. Edward's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. The letter began with an apology and a confession. The truth about Scarlett's disappearance was far darker than anyone had imagined. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind for Julia. The truth of her identity had thrown her into a world she never thought she'd be a part of. A world of wealth, privilege, and deep-rooted family secrets. The Sullivan estate, once an intimidating symbol of her dismissal and humiliation, was now a place she frequented daily. But no matter how many times she stepped through its grand doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Edward, on the other hand, was relentless in his efforts to bridge the gap of lost time. He showered her with attention, telling her stories about her childhood and sharing cherished memories of Scarlett. Yet, despite his good intentions, Julia felt the weight of expectations pressing down on her. She wasn't the daughter he had lost. She was someone entirely different, shaped by a life far removed from the luxuries of the Sullivan name. One morning, Edward invited Julia to join him for breakfast in the estate's opulent dining room. The long table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and enough food to feed a small army. Julia sat stiffly, acutely aware of how out of place she felt amid the grandeur. "You don't have to be so formal, you know," Edward said with a chuckle, noticing her discomfort. "It's just breakfast." Julia offered a tight smile, picking at a piece of toast. "I'm not used to all of this." "And you don't have to be," he assured her. "Take your time. This is your home now." His words hung in the air. Heavy with implication, Julia wanted to believe him, but the skeptical glances from the staff and the cold demeanor of Janet made it clear that not everyone shared his sentiment. As if on cue, Janet entered the room, her presence as sharp as the clack of her heels against the marble floor. She greeted Edward with a kiss on the cheek before turning her icy gaze to Julia. "I see you're settling in," Janet remarked, her tone dripping with condescension. "How adaptable of you." Julia bristled but forced herself to remain composed. "I'm doing my best." Edward shot Janet a warning look. "Janet, that's enough." "Oh, come on, Edward," Janet said with a dismissive wave. "You can't expect everyone to adjust overnight. It's a lot to take in." Julia clenched her fists under the table, feeling the sting of Janet's words. It wasn't the first time she'd been on the receiving end of the woman's disdain, and she doubted it would be the last. Later that afternoon, Julia found solace in the estate's expansive gardens. The vibrant flowers and neatly trimmed hedges were a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions swirling within her. She wandered aimlessly until she stumbled upon a small bench tucked away beneath a willow tree. Sitting down, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her thoughts drifted to the letter her mother had written, the one that Edward had read aloud just days before. The words still echoed in her mind, a haunting confession that changed everything. Scarlett's disappearance wasn't an accident. The revelation had shaken Edward to his core, but it had also raised more questions than answers. Who was responsible and why? Julia had seen the pain in Edward's eyes as he grappled with the possibility that someone close to him could have orchestrated such a heinous act. Lost in thought, Julia didn't notice Edward approaching until he spoke. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked up and nodded. Scooting over to make room, Edward sat beside her, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet lately," he observed. "I don't blame you. This is a lot to process," Julia sighed, tracing the veins of a fallen leaf in her hand. "It's more than a lot. I feel like my whole life has been turned upside down, and now, I don't know who to trust." Edward's jaw tightened. "I understand, but I promise you, Julia, we'll get to the bottom of this. Whoever was behind Scarlett's disappearance, they'll answer for it." Julia hesitated before speaking. "Do you think Janet could be involved?" Edward's expression darkened. I don't want to believe it, but there are things about that day, things I ignored at the time, that don't add up. And Janet, she's always been protective of the family's image. Too protective, maybe. Julia swallowed hard. The thought of Janet being responsible for the tragedy that had defined both their lives was almost too much to bear. But the tension between them was undeniable, and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Janet knew more than she let on. That evening, Julia sat alone in the guest room that Edward had insisted she stay in. The room was beautifully furnished, with silk curtains and a plush bed that felt more like a cloud. Yet despite its comfort, Julia couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying every interaction she'd had with Janet since her return to the estate. The woman's hostility was palpable, but was it just jealousy? Or was it something deeper, reaching for the photo she had found in the storage room? Julia studied the image of a young Edward and Scarlett. The little girl's bright smile and sparkling eyes were hauntingly familiar, yet alien at the same time. Julia wondered if she would ever truly feel like she belonged in this world. As the night wore on, Julia made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth about Scarlett's disappearance. No matter how painful or complicated it might be, she owed it to herself, to her mother, and to the man who had spent 20 years searching for his lost daughter. The Sullivan estate seemed colder the next morning, the tension almost tangible as Julia walked through its grand halls. The staff, while polite, still regarded her with subtle glances of doubt, their skepticism hanging in the air like a cloud she couldn't escape. She didn't blame them entirely. To them, she was an outsider, suddenly thrust into a life that didn't seem to fit her, but the weight of distrust came from more than just the staff. Janet's icy demeanor had only grown more cutting, her words laced with subtle barbs at every opportunity. Julia was determined not to let it get to her, but the undercurrent of hostility was impossible to ignore. As she entered the dining room for breakfast, she found Edward already seated at the head of the table. Reading a newspaper, he looked up and smiled warmly when he saw her. "Good morning, Julia," he greeted. "Sleep well." She hesitated before sitting down. "Well enough, I suppose." Edward folded the paper and leaned forward. "I was thinking we could take a look at some of the family albums today. There are photos of Scarlett I'd like to share with you." Julia gave a small nod, though the thought of delving deeper into the past made her stomach churn. "Sure, that sounds nice." Before Edward could respond, Janet entered the room, her presence commanding as always. She swept her sharp gaze across the table, her lips pressing into a thin line when they landed on Julia. "Another cozy family breakfast, I see," Janet remarked, her tone cool. She sat down with a grace that seemed almost rehearsed, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Edward's brow furrowed. "Janet, we've discussed this. Julia is part of this family now. I'd appreciate it if you treated her as such." Janet raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "Of course, Edward, but it's a little soon to expect everyone to embrace such a sudden revelation, don't you think?" Julia bristled, but kept her expression neutral. She wasn't going to give Janet the satisfaction of a reaction. Edward's voice hardened. "Enough, Janet. I won't tolerate this." Janet set her cup down with a soft clink, her calm mask slipping just enough to reveal the tension beneath. "I'm simply stating the obvious. Trust isn't earned overnight, Edward. Surely even Julia can understand that." Julia met Janet's gaze, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "I understand perfectly, but trust goes both ways, doesn't it?" Janet's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing more. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Later that day, Julia found herself wandering through the mansion's gallery, a long corridor lined with portraits and framed photographs of the Sullivan family. She stopped in front of a large painting of Edward with a woman and a young child, his late wife and Scarlett. The child in the painting was laughing, her golden curls framing a face full of innocence and joy. Julia's throat tightened as she studied the image. It felt strange to see a version of herself she didn't recognize, a life she had never known. Footsteps echoed behind her, and she turned to see Edward approaching, carrying a thick leather-bound photo album. "I thought you might like to see these," he said, holding out the album. Julia hesitated before taking it. "Thank you." Edward gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat together as she opened the album. The pages were filled with images of Scarlett, birthday parties, family vacations, candid moments that captured her vibrant spirit. She was a handful, Edward said with a wistful smile, always getting into mischief. But she had a heart of gold. Julia ran her fingers over one photo of Scarlett holding a flower crown. She looks happy. She was, Edward said softly. And I want you to be too, Julia. This is your family now. You belong here, whether you feel it yet or not. Julia bit her lip, unsure how to respond. She wanted to believe him, but the shadows of doubt, both her own and those cast by others, were hard to ignore. Meanwhile, Janet paced her private sitting room, her mind racing. She had spent years carefully curating her place in the Sullivan family, and Julia's sudden arrival threatened everything. Janet had always prided herself on her ability to control the narrative, but this time, the cracks in her facade were starting to show. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, smoothing her expression into one of calm composure. The family's lawyer, a man named Howard Lane, entered with a folder in hand. "You asked to see me, Mrs. Brooks." Janet nodded, motioning for him to sit. "I need to know everything about Julia Carter. Her past, her connections, anything that could explain why she's suddenly reappeared in our lives." Howard hesitated. "With all due respect, Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Sullivan seems to have accepted her as his daughter. Are you certain?" "I didn't ask for your opinion, Howard," Janet snapped. "Just do as I say." Howard nodded reluctantly, leaving Janet alone once more. She stared out the window, her jaw clenched. Julia Carter was a problem, and Janet was determined to find a way to solve it. That evening, Julia sat on the balcony of her guest room, gazing out at the estate's sprawling grounds. The day had been exhausting, and her mind was heavy with unanswered questions. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Maria. "How's it going over there? Still feels weird." Julia typed back quickly. "Weird doesn't even begin to cover it. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells." Maria's response came almost instantly. "Don't let them get to you. You have just as much right to be there as anyone." Julia sighed, her friend's words offering a small measure of comfort. She slipped the phone into her pocket and leaned against the railing, her resolve hardening. If Janet thought she could intimidate her into leaving, she was sorely mistaken. Julia wasn't going anywhere, not until she uncovered the truth. The Sullivan mansion loomed in the late afternoon light, its grand architecture casting long shadows across the estate's manicured lawns. Julia walked briskly down one of the quieter hallways, her thoughts a jumble of tension and determination. The mounting unease she felt around Janet's behavior was gnawing at her, and she couldn't shake the sense that something vital was being hidden from her. She paused outside a closed door, curiosity pulling her attention. The handle turned easily under her hand, and she found herself in what appeared to be an old storage room. Dust motes danced in the streams of sunlight filtering through a small, grimy window. Boxes and furniture were haphazardly piled, their contents a chaotic mix of forgotten history. Julia hesitated, unsure of what she was looking for, until her eyes landed on an ornate chest tucked into the corner. The intricate carvings on its surface seemed to call to her. She crossed the room, brushing aside cobwebs as she knelt in front of it. The lid creaked as she opened it, revealing a collection of items that seemed untouched by time. Faded photographs, delicate trinkets, and a stack of letters tied with a red ribbon. Julia's heart skipped a beat as she reached for the bundle. One of the letters, slightly torn at the edges, caught her eye. It was addressed to Edward, and the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. She unfolded it carefully, her breath hitching as she read the first few lines. "Edward, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with Julia to tell her the truth myself. Please know that everything I did was to protect her." Julia's hands trembled as she continued reading. "Scarlett's disappearance wasn't an accident. I never intended to keep her from you. But when things spiraled out of control, I had no choice. Someone close to you orchestrated everything, and I feared what would happen if the truth came to light." Her mother's words blurred as tears filled her eyes. This wasn't just a confession. It was a warning. The letter didn't name anyone directly, but Julia didn't need it to. Her gut told her who it was. Janet. Later that evening, Julia sat in her guest room, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She had read it over and over, each pass solidifying her resolve. Her mother had sacrificed everything to protect her, and Julia couldn't let that be in vain. She needed to confront Edward. When she found him in the study, he was seated at his desk, Deep in thought, the sight of him, once so imposing but now softened by years of grief, made her hesitate. But this wasn't a moment for doubt. "Edward," she began, stepping into the room, "I need to show you something." He looked up, his brow furrowing in concern as she handed him the letter. As he read, his expression darkened, his hands tightening around the paper. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "In a storage room," Julia replied. "It was tucked away in an old chest. I thought it might help explain." Edward stood abruptly, pacing the room as he processed the revelation. "This can't be right," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. "Janet wouldn't—" "You can't ignore the signs, Edward," Julia said firmly. "She's been hostile toward me from the start. And now this. It's too much to dismiss as coincidence." Edward stopped pacing, his jaw tightening as his eyes met hers. "If Janet was involved in Scarlett's disappearance, I don't even know where to begin." Julia hesitated, her voice softening. "I think the only way to move forward is to confront her. We need answers." The next morning, Edward called Janet to the study under the pretense of discussing estate matters. Julia waited in the adjacent sitting room, her heart pounding as she strained to hear their conversation. "Janet," Edward began, his tone carefully measured, "I've come across something that requires an explanation." Janet raised an eyebrow, her expression one of mild annoyance. "What is it now, Edward? Another dramatic twist in your newfound paternal instincts?" Edward's hand tightened around the letter in his pocket. "This isn't about Julia. It's about Scarlett, and about what really happened to her." For the briefest moment, Janet's composed exterior faltered. Her eyes flickered with something Julia couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But just as quickly, she masked it with a scoff. "Scarlett's disappearance was a tragedy," Janet said, her voice clipped. "And dredging it up now won't change anything." Edward's voice hardened. "I have reason to believe it wasn't an accident." Janet stiffened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "Where are you getting this nonsense?" Edward pulled the letter from his pocket, holding it up for her to see. "From this, a letter Julia's mother wrote before she died. She knew something, Janet. Something about you." The silence that followed was deafening. Julia held her breath, waiting for Janet's response. Finally, Janet spoke, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "That woman didn't know what she was talking about. She was a maid, Edward. A maid. Are you really going to take her word over mine?" Edward's eyes narrowed. "I trusted you. Janet, I trusted you with everything. But now I'm starting to wonder if that trust was misplaced." When Janet stormed out of the study moments later, Julia quickly stepped back into the shadows, her heart racing. She hadn't expected Janet to crack so easily, but the woman's reaction had all but confirmed her guilt. Julia emerged from her hiding place as Edward appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "She knows something," he said simply. "And I won't stop until I find out what." Julia nodded, her resolve matching his. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. The morning after Janet's stormy exit, the Sullivan estate felt heavier, its grand hallways echoing with an uneasy silence. Julia sat at the small table in her guest room, staring at the letter her mother had written. The words weighed heavily on her, a haunting reminder of the secrets buried within the family. She had spent the night replaying Janet's reaction in her mind. The sharpness of her words, the tremor in her voice. It was clear she was hiding something. Julia knew they couldn't afford to let it go. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Edward stood in the doorway, his expression resolute. "We need to speak with someone who was there that day," he said. "Someone who might have seen something Janet doesn't want us to know." Julia stood, nodding. "Who do you have in mind?" Edward hesitated, his brow furrowing. "An old staff member, Mrs. Callahan. She worked as a nanny back then. If anyone would know what really happened, it's her." The drive to Mrs. Callahan's modest home in the city was tense. Edward gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set in determination. Julia sat quietly beside him, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Do you think she'll talk to us?" Julia asked, breaking the silence. "She left the estate not long after Scarlett's disappearance," Edward said. "It was a mutual decision, but she always had a fondness for Scarlett. If she knows anything, I believe she'll tell us." When they arrived, Mrs. Callahan greeted them at the door with a mix of surprise and apprehension. She was a petite woman with kind eyes that had dulled over the years. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, stepping aside to let them in. "It's been a long time." "It has," Edward replied, his tone softer now. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice." Once they were seated in her cozy living room, Edward didn't waste time. "Mrs. Callahan, we're here about Scarlett. I know it's been years, but we've recently uncovered new information. Things that suggest her disappearance wasn't an accident." Mrs. Callahan's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I always wondered if there was more to it," she admitted. "That day, there were things that didn't sit right with me." Julia leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Callahan sighed, wringing her hands. Janet was always particular about the family's image. She didn't like anything that might disrupt the status quo. Scarlett was a bright child, full of energy, but she didn't fit into Janet's vision of how things should be. "I overheard her more than once saying things like, 'That child is a liability.' At the time, I thought she was just being harsh." Edward's face darkened. "What else, Mrs. Callahan?" The older woman hesitated. "On the day Scarlett disappeared, Janet was acting strangely. She kept insisting on taking Scarlett to the lake alone. I thought it was unusual, but I didn't question it. Later, when Scarlett was nowhere to be found, Janet seemed too calm, almost as if she knew it was coming." The words sent a chill down Julia's spine. She glanced at Edward, whose hands were clenched into fists. "Why didn't you say anything before?" he asked, his voice tight. "I was scared," Mrs. Callahan admitted, her voice trembling. "Janet had a way of making people feel small, and after Scarlett was gone, the atmosphere in the house was unbearable. I thought it was best to leave." Julia reached out, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's arm. "Thank you for telling us. This helps more than you know." The drive back to the estate was quiet. Both Julia and Edward lost in thought. Mrs. Callahan's account had confirmed their suspicions, but it also raised more questions. If Janet had orchestrated Scarlett's disappearance, what had she hoped to gain? As they pulled into the driveway, Edward finally broke the silence. "We need more than suspicions and old memories. Janet's clever. She'll deny everything unless we have concrete evidence." Julia nodded. "So, where do we look?" Edward's gaze hardened. "The estate. There must be something. Records. Letters. Anything. That proves what she did." That evening, Julia began searching the mansion's library, combing through old documents and ledgers. The vast collection of records was daunting, but she refused to let that deter her. Edward joined her after a while, working silently by her side. Hours passed with no breakthroughs, and exhaustion began to set in. Julia was about to suggest taking a break when she stumbled upon a stack of correspondence tucked away in a drawer. Among the neatly folded letters was one addressed to Janet, in unfamiliar handwriting. "Edward," she called, holding up the letter. He crossed the room quickly, taking the envelope from her. As he unfolded the paper, his expression shifted from curiosity to shock. The letter was brief, but its contents were damning. It spoke of an arrangement between Janet and an unnamed individual, referencing payment for handling the matter discreetly. "This is it," Edward said, his voice low and steady. "This is the proof we needed." Julia stared at the letter, her mind racing. "What do we do now?" Edward's jaw tightened. "We confront her tomorrow morning. Janet answers for what she's done." As Julia lay in bed that night, the letter's words replayed in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that their confrontation with Janet would bring more than just answers. It would change everything. The sun had barely risen when Edward and Julia sat in the study, the damning letter laid out on the desk between them. Edward leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. The gravity of what they were about to do hung heavily in the air. "This letter, it's enough to confront her," Edward said. Breaking the silence, Julia nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought. "Do you think she'll admit to it?" "She'll have no choice," Edward replied firmly. "But don't underestimate Janet. She'll fight to protect herself." The tension was palpable as they waited for Janet to join them. Edward had summoned her under the guise of discussing estate matters, careful not to give away his true intentions. When Janet entered the room, she was as composed as ever, her sharp eyes darting between Edward and Julia. "What's so urgent that it couldn't wait?" she asked, a note of irritation in her voice. Edward gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down." "Janet, we need to talk." Janet raised an eyebrow, but complied, her posture straight and her expression guarded. "I assume this is about Julia again." "It's about Scarlett," Edward corrected, his tone cold. He slid the letter across the desk toward her. "Read this." Janet's eyes flickered with a hint of unease as she picked up the letter. Her expression remained neutral as she scanned the contents, but Julia noticed the subtle tightening of her grip. When she finished, Janet set the letter down and folded her hands in her lap. "And where, exactly, did you find this?" "In the library," Edward said, "hidden among old correspondence." "Care to explain?" Janet's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "Explain what, Edward?" "A vague letter with no names or specifics. It's hardly incriminating." Julia's frustration bubbled over. "It's enough to show you were involved in Scarlett's disappearance. You paid someone to handle the matter discreetly. What else could that mean?" Janet turned her sharp gaze to Julia. "Careful, dear. Accusations like that can have consequences." Edward's fist slammed against the desk, startling both women. "Stop playing games, Janet. This letter, combined with what we've learned from Mrs. Callahan, paints a damning picture. You orchestrated Scarlett's disappearance, didn't you?" For the first time, Janet's composure cracked. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes burned with something between anger and fear. "I did what I had to do," she said finally, her voice low and venomous. Julia's heart sank. She had suspected it all along, but hearing Janet admit it was still a shock. "Why?" she demanded. "What could a 5-year-old have done to make you do something so cruel?" Janet's gaze shifted to Edward, her expression hardening. "You were blinded by your love for her. Scarlett was a liability, Edward. She was impulsive, unruly, and constantly drawing attention to herself. The family's reputation was at stake. I couldn't let her jeopardize everything." Edward's voice trembled with fury. "So you had her taken away. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Janet's laugh was bitter. "I was protecting this family. Something you've never been able to do. You've always been too sentimental, too willing to overlook the bigger picture." Julia stood, her hands trembling. "You didn't protect anyone, Janet. You destroyed lives. Scarlett's, Edward's, and mine." Janet's eyes narrowed. "You should be thanking me. If I hadn't intervened, you wouldn't even be standing here. You'd have been lost in the chaos of that child's antics." Edward's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Get out, Janet. You're no longer welcome here." Janet's mouth opened as if to argue, but she seemed to think better of it. She rose from her chair, her movements stiff and deliberate. "You'll regret this, Edward," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Mark my words," as she left the study. The tension in the room remained thick. Edward sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. "She's gone," Julia said softly, though the words felt hollow. "But what now?" Edward looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Now we figure out how to move forward, together." Later that evening, as the weight of the day settled over the estate, Julia sat alone in the gardens. The crisp night air was a welcome relief from the suffocating tension of the mansion. She thought about Scarlett, the sister she had never known, and the life that had been stolen from both of them. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a wound that had been ripped open. Raw and painful, Edward found her there, his footsteps soft on the gravel path. "Mind if I join you?" Julia shook her head, and he sat beside her on the bench. "I've spent so many years searching for answers," Edward said quietly. "And now that I have them, I don't know what to do with them." Julia nodded, her gaze fixed on the stars. "I feel the same, but we can't change the past. All we can do is move forward." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but reassuring. "You're right, and we'll honor Scarlett by making sure the truth is never buried again." Julia smiled faintly, though her heart still ached. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. The aftermath of Janet's departure left the Sullivan estate in a state of uneasy quiet, though her absence brought relief. The damage she had caused lingered like a shadow over the household. The staff whispered cautiously, unsure of what her exile might mean for them. Meanwhile, Julia and Edward tried to navigate the aftermath of the confrontation, their bond growing stronger but strained under the weight of unresolved emotions. Julia stood in the grand kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea. She could hear the murmurs of the house staff from the other room, questions, speculations, and doubts that reminded her she still wasn't fully accepted here. Her mind wandered back to Janet's final words. "You'll regret this, Edward." She had meant it as a threat, and Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Janet wasn't done causing trouble. Edward entered the kitchen, his expression weary but determined. "I've spoken to the legal team," he said, leaning against the counter. "Janet won't have access to the family accounts or estate anymore." Julia nodded, though her stomach twisted. "Do you think that's enough to stop her?" Edward hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. Janet's resourceful, but without the power of the Sullivan name behind her, she's limited. I won't let her interfere with our lives anymore. His resolve was comforting, but Julia knew Janet wasn't the type to walk away quietly. Later that day, Edward received an unexpected call from an old family friend, Richard Bellamy, who had heard whispers of Janet's departure, a prominent businessman and one of Edward's closest confidants. Richard had always been deeply connected to the Sullivan family's inner workings. "You've stirred quite the pot, Edward," Richard said over the phone. Janet's been making calls, spreading stories. Edward's grip on the receiver tightened. "What kind of stories?" Richard sighed. "She's painting you as reckless, claiming you've lost your grip on the family legacy. She's even suggested that Julia's sudden appearance is part of some elaborate scheme to manipulate you." Edward's face darkened. "She's trying to undermine everything, but I won't let her." "You need to be careful," Richard warned. "Janet has friends in high places, and she's not afraid to use them." Edward hung up, frustration simmering beneath his composed exterior. He found Julia in the library, flipping through an old photo album. The sight of her, so focused and serene, eased his tension for a moment, but as he explained the situation, her brow furrowed with concern. "So, she's not done," Julia said, her voice steady despite the unease in her chest. "No," Edward admitted, "but neither are we." The next morning, Julia decided to take a more active role in uncovering the truth about Scarlett's disappearance. The revelations from Janet and the letter had answered some questions, but left many more hanging in the air. Julia felt a deep need to piece together the full picture, not just for Edward, but for herself. She began by combing through the estate's archives, searching for any records or correspondence that might shed light on Scarlett's final days. Edward joined her, their shared determination creating a sense of camaraderie that felt oddly comforting amidst the turmoil. It was in one of the estate's older filing cabinets that Julia found something peculiar, a ledger from the time of Scarlett's disappearance. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary financial record, but one entry caught her eye: a substantial payment to an unknown recipient, labeled only as services rendered. "Edward," she called, holding up the ledger. "Take a look at this." He examined the entry, his expression darkening. "This lines up with what Janet said about handling the situation. This payment could be to whoever she hired." "Do you recognize the account number?" Julia asked. Edward shook his head. "No, but I know someone who might." That evening, Edward contacted the family's former accountant, a retired man named George Whitaker, who had managed the estate's finances for decades. When they visited his modest home the next day, George greeted them warmly, though his face clouded with concern when Edward explained the reason for their visit. "This payment," Edward said, showing him the ledger. "It was made around the time Scarlett disappeared. Do you remember anything about it?" George adjusted his glasses, peering at the entry. "I recall this vaguely. It was unusual. Janet insisted on keeping it off the main records, said it was a personal matter. I questioned it, but she assured me it was nothing to worry about." Julia's stomach churned. "Do you know who the payment went to?" George hesitated, then nodded. "A private investigator, someone Janet had been working with for years. I always found it odd, but I didn't press her." Edward's hands clenched into fists. "Do you have a name?" George retrieved an old notebook, flipping through its yellowed pages. "Here it is, Victor Landry. That's the investigator Janet used." Julia exchanged a glance with Edward, her heart pounding. They finally had a lead, a real name tied to Janet's actions, as they left George's house. Edward's determination was palpable. "We need to find this Victor Landry. If anyone knows the full extent of what Janet did, it's him. Julia nodded, though unease crept into her chest. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were headed towards something even darker than they had imagined. The car ride back to the estate was quiet, both of them lost in thought. When they arrived, Julia paused before stepping out of the car. "Edward," she said softly, what if what we find changes everything? What if it's worse than we think?" Edward looked at her, his gaze steady. "Then we face it. Together." Julia nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. The following morning, Edward wasted no time contacting an investigative agency to locate Victor Landry, the private investigator Janet had hired 2 decades earlier. Julia watched him work with a quiet determination that mirrored her own. Every step forward brought them closer to answers, but the weight of what they might uncover loomed over them both. By late afternoon, the agency had tracked down Landry to a small office in the outskirts of the city. Edward and Julia decided to confront him in person. Unwilling to let any detail slip through the cracks, Landry's office was tucked away in a dilapidated building that smelled faintly of mildew and stale coffee. The man himself was as unassuming as his surroundings. Middle-aged, with graying hair and an air of disheveled weariness, he looked up from his cluttered desk as Edward and Julia entered, his brow furrowing in suspicion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Edward stepped forward, his tone firm. "Victor Landry. That's me," the man replied cautiously. "My name is Edward Sullivan, and this is Julia Carter," Edward continued. "We're here to talk about a job you took for my sister, Janet Brooks, 20 years ago." Landry's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he masked it with indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about." Julia took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "We know Janet hired you, there's no point in denying it." Landry leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Even if I did, that was a long time ago. I don't keep records that far back." Edward placed the letter and ledger on the desk, his voice cold. "We found evidence of the payment she made to you. We're not here to play games, Mr. Landry. We just want the truth." Landry stared at the documents for a long moment, the tension in the room thickening with each passing second. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I don't like getting involved in family drama, but Janet was persuasive." Julia's heart raced. "What did she ask you to do?" Landry hesitated, his gaze shifting between them. "She hired me to follow someone, a nanny who worked for your family at the time, Mrs. Callahan. Janet suspected she was planning to take Scarlett and disappear." Julia's stomach dropped. "Why would she think that?" Landry shrugged. "Janet said the nanny was too attached to the kid, and she didn't trust her. She wanted me to dig up dirt, anything she could use to fire her quietly, but then things got complicated." Edward's voice hardened. "Complicated how?" Landry rubbed his temples, as though trying to push away the memory. "The day Scarlett disappeared, Janet called me in a panic. She said Mrs. Callahan had gone rogue and taken Scarlett. She wanted me to track them down and resolve the situation." Julia's blood ran cold. "Resolve? What does that mean?" "I didn't ask," Landry said, his voice quiet. "But I wasn't about to get involved in something like that. I told Janet I was out, and I left. Whatever happened after that, I don't know." Edward's fists clenched at his sides. "You're telling me you walked away and let a 5-year-old girl disappear without a trace?" Landry's expression hardened. "I didn't have proof of anything. And frankly, people like Janet don't take kindly to being told no. I figured the safest thing for me was to step back." Julia's voice trembled as she spoke. "Did you ever see Scarlett again?" Landry shook his head. "No, but if Janet was desperate enough to hire me, then she was capable of anything." The drive back to the estate was somber, the weight of Landry's confession pressing heavily on Julia and Edward. Though Landry's account hadn't answered all their questions, it painted a chilling picture of Janet's desperation and manipulative tendencies. Julia stared out the window, her mind swirling with thoughts of her mother. If Mrs. Callahan had been Janet's target, then her mother might have known more about Scarlett's disappearance than she had ever let on. But why had she kept it a secret? "We're getting closer," Edward said, breaking the silence. "Janet's lies are unraveling. It's only a matter of time before we uncover the whole truth." Julia nodded, though unease crept into her chest. Do you think Janet will try to stop us? She'll try, Edward admitted. But she won't succeed. Not this time. That evening, as Julia prepared for bed, she found herself holding her mother's ring, its familiar design offering a small measure of comfort. She thought about Landry's words, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clearer picture. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Interrupting her thoughts, it was a text from Maria. How's everything? Any updates? Julia hesitated before responding. We found someone who worked with Janet. He confirmed she orchestrated Scarlett's disappearance. Maria's reply came quickly. That's huge. What happens now? Julia stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, she typed, We're getting closer to the truth, but I don't know if I'm ready for what comes next. As she lay in bed, the words of Landry's confession echoed in her mind. Every revelation brought her closer to understanding the truth about her family, but it also brought new fears and uncertainties. Julia closed her eyes, knowing that the road ahead would be anything but easy. The air in the Sullivan estate was heavy with anticipation. The next morning, Edward had been up early, pacing the study as he reviewed everything they had uncovered. The ledger. The letter, and Victor Landry's confession painted a clear, damning picture of Janet's involvement in Scarlett's disappearance. It was time to confront her directly, and this time, there would be no escape. Julia stood by the window, watching as the late autumn sunlight filtered through the trees. She could feel Edward's tension, and it mirrored her own. The truths they had unearthed were devastating, but there was still one final piece missing. They needed Janet to admit everything. No denials, no excuses, just the cold, unvarnished truth. When Janet arrived, her expression was as sharp as ever. Though there was an edge of apprehension in her movements, she had been summoned by Edward without explanation, and her patience was already wearing thin. What's this about, Edward? Janet asked, crossing her arms as she entered the study. Her gaze flickered to Julia, narrowing slightly. And why is she here? Edward didn't waste time. He gestured for her to sit, his tone cold and commanding. We have questions, Janet, and this time, I expect answers. Janet raised an eyebrow, but complied, lowering herself into the chair opposite him. I've already told you everything I know. Dragging me here won't change anything. Edward leaned forward, his eyes blazing with intensity. You haven't told us the truth, Janet, but we found it anyway. He placed the ledger and the letter on the desk in front of her. Janet's face remained carefully neutral, but Julia noticed the slight tightening of her jaw. I don't see what this has to do with me, Janet said. Her voice clipped. It has everything to do with you. Edward shot back. The payment to Victor Landry, the letter from Julia's mother, and Landry's confession, it all points to you orchestrating Scarlett's disappearance. Don't insult us by pretending otherwise. Janet's composure cracked, her hands clenching the arms of the chair. You have no idea what you're talking about. Julia stepped forward, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. We know enough. We know you saw Scarlett as a liability. We know you hired Landry to follow Mrs. Callahan. And we know you panicked when Scarlett disappeared. Janet's gaze darted between them, her defenses crumbling under the weight of their accusations. Finally, she let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Fine, she said, her voice sharp. You want the truth? Yes. I orchestrated Scarlett's disappearance, but it wasn't supposed to happen like this. Edward's breath caught, and Julia's heart pounded in her chest. They had suspected as much, but hearing Janet admit it was still a gut punch. Explain, Edward demanded, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. Janet exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging as she leaned back in the chair. Scarlett was difficult. She didn't fit into the image of the perfect family. She was impulsive, always drawing attention to herself, and you let her do it, Edward. You were too blinded by your love for her to see the damage she was causing. She was a child, Janet, Edward snapped. A 5-year-old girl. And that's exactly why I had to act, Janet retorted, her voice rising. I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted to remove her from the equation. I thought if she was taken somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, she could grow up without endangering the family's reputation. Julia's hands balled into fists. And you thought hiring someone to take her away was the answer. Do you even hear yourself? Janet's face twisted with anger and regret. It was a mistake. I didn't know Mrs. Callahan would intervene when she took Scarlett. Everything spiraled out of control. I tried to fix it, but it was too late. Edward's voice was ice cold. Too late. You destroyed this family, Janet. You stole Scarlett from us, and you let us believe she was gone forever. Janet's composure shattered completely, tears welling in her eyes. I never meant for it to go this far, I thought. I thought it would all work out. Julia's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Well, it didn't, and now we're left to pick up the pieces. The confrontation left the room charged with an eerie stillness. Janet slumped in her chair, her bravado gone, replaced by the weight of her guilt. Edward stood silently, his expression one of heartbreak and betrayal. Julia's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the desk. Her emotions a storm she struggled to contain. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice quiet but firm. You need to leave. Janet, for good. Janet looked up, her tear-streaked face a shadow of the confident woman she had once been. Edward, please. Don't, he interrupted, his voice sharp. You've done enough damage. I can't forgive you for what you've done. Janet nodded slowly, rising to her feet. She cast one last glance at Julia, her expression unreadable, before walking out of the room. That night, the estate felt quieter than ever. Julia sat on the balcony of her guest room, staring out at the darkened gardens. The truth had finally come out, but it didn't feel like a victory. The scars Janet had left ran deep, and they would take time to heal. Edward joined her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He sat beside her, the weight of the day evident in his tired eyes. We did the right thing, he said softly, but it doesn't make it easier. Julia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. It never does. For a moment they sat in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. Despite the pain, there was a sense of closure, a glimmer of hope that they could begin to move forward. And for the first time, Julia felt like she truly belonged. The days following Janet's final departure were quieter, yet the weight of her confession lingered over the Sullivan estate. Edward had thrown himself into work, as if focusing on business could dull the ache of betrayal. Meanwhile, Julia wandered the halls of the mansion, unsure of her place in a world that had been reshaped by painful truths. She found herself drawn to Scarlett's room, preserved like a time capsule from the day she disappeared. The pastel walls, the neatly arranged toys, and the small bookshelf brimming with children's stories all painted a picture of the life Scarlett might have lived. Julia ran her fingers along the spines of the books, her chest tightening with a mix of sorrow and longing. Edward found her there one evening, standing by the window with a faded teddy bear in her hands. His footsteps were soft, but she turned at the sound, offering him a small, wistful smile. It feels strange being here, Julia admitted, like I'm intruding on someone else's life. Edward's face softened, and he stepped closer. You're not intruding, Julia. Scarlett was a part of this family, and so are you. Julia sighed, setting the teddy bear back on the shelf. It's just, I can't stop thinking about her, what she went through, what she might have become. Edward nodded, his expression heavy with regret. Not a day goes by that I don't think about her. But you've brought a part of her back to us. That's something I'll always be grateful for. The following morning, Julia made a decision. She couldn't stay in the mansion indefinitely, surrounded by ghosts of a past. She was still trying to reconcile. She needed to find her own way forward, one that honored both Scarlett's memory and her own identity. Over breakfast, she broached the subject with Edward. I've been thinking, she began, her tone tentative, about what's next for me. Edward set down his coffee, concern flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? I can't stay here forever, Julia said gently. This has been overwhelming, to say the least. But I think it's time for me to focus on my life, what I want to do, who I want to be. Edward's brow furrowed. You're my daughter, Julia. This is your home now. I know, Julia said, reaching across the table to place a hand over his. And I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, but I need to find my own path. I need to figure out how to make sense of all this. Edward hesitated, then nodded slowly, I understand, but I want you to know, wherever you go, whatever you do, I'll always be here for you. Julia smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you. That means everything. Over the next few days, Julia began making plans to leave the estate. She had decided to return to her work as a nurse. Using her newfound resources to help others the way she had always wanted, it was a way to honor both her mother and Scarlett, channeling her pain into something meaningful. Edward supported her decision wholeheartedly, even arranging for her to meet with influential contacts in the medical field. His pride in her was evident, though Julia could see the sadness in his eyes whenever they discussed her departure. On her last evening at the estate, Edward organized a small farewell dinner. The dining room, usually so grand and formal, felt warm and intimate with just the two of them seated at the long table. Candles flickered softly, casting a golden glow over the room. As the meal wound down, Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He slid it across the table to Julia, his expression tender. "I wanted you to have this," he said. Julia opened the box to reveal a delicate necklace, its pendant a tiny gold locket shaped like a flower, an exact match to the ring she had cherished for so long. Her breath caught, tears welling in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." Edward smiled. "Inside is a picture of Scarlett. I thought it might be a way to keep her close, no matter where life takes you." Julia's fingers trembled as she opened the locket, revealing a tiny black and white photo of Scarlett's smiling face. She looked up at Edward, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure it." The next morning, Julia stood at the front steps of the mansion, her bags packed and a cab waiting in the driveway. Edward stood beside her, his hands in his pockets as he tried to mask his sadness. "This isn't goodbye," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You'll always have a place here, Julia." She nodded, her own emotions threatening to spill over. "I know, and I'll be back to visit. But for now, I need to do this." Edward pulled her into a tight hug, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm proud of you, more than you'll ever know." Julia smiled through her tears as she pulled away. "Take care of yourself, okay? And take care of Scarlett's room. For her. I will," Edward promised. As Julia climbed into the cab and it pulled away, she glanced back at the mansion one last time. It was no longer just a symbol of wealth and privilege. It was a place where she had found pieces of herself she hadn't even known were missing. And as she turned her gaze forward, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to face it. The world outside the Sullivan estate felt different, almost unfamiliar. As Julia stepped out of the cab and onto the streets of her old neighborhood, she realized how much had changed in the short time since she left. The narrow sidewalks and modest apartments that once felt like home now seemed smaller, their imperfections more pronounced. Yet, there was comfort in the familiarity. A reminder of the life she had fought to build before the whirlwind of revelations turned everything upside down. Julia carried her bags up the creaking stairs to her apartment, pausing for a moment before unlocking the door. The small, sparsely decorated space welcomed her back like an old friend. She set her bags down and let out a deep breath, allowing the stillness of the room to wash over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. Over the next few days, Julia returned to her work as a nurse. The routine was grounding, the familiar hum of the hospital a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind at the Sullivan estate. Her patients greeted her with warmth and gratitude, reminding her why she had chosen this path in the first place. But the changes in her life were undeniable. With the resources Edward had provided, Julia found herself in a position to make a greater impact. She began volunteering at a shelter for abandoned children, inspired by her own journey and the memory of Scarlett. The children, full of wide-eyed wonder and resilience, ignited a fire within her to do more. One afternoon, as Julia helped a young boy bandage a scraped knee, she felt her phone buzz in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw Edward's name on the screen. "Hi, Edward," she said, smiling despite herself. "Julia." His voice was warm, yet tinged with a hint of nervousness. "How are you settling in?" "Better than I expected," Julia admitted. "It's good to be back in a routine." "I'm glad to hear that," Edward said. There was a pause before he continued, his tone more serious. "I was wondering if you'd be open to a visit. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Julia hesitated. Curiosity piqued. "Of course, when were you thinking? Would tomorrow work?" Edward asked. I could come to the shelter. I'd like to see the work you're doing, Julia agreed. And as the call ended, she couldn't help but wonder what was on his mind. The following day, Edward arrived at the shelter dressed more casually than Julia had ever seen him. He greeted the staff politely, but his attention quickly turned to the children. Julia watched from a distance as he knelt to speak with a group of kids building a block tower, his normally reserved demeanor softening in their presence. "You're a natural," Julia teased as she approached him. Edward chuckled, standing to meet her gaze. "It's been a long time since I've been around children, but they have a way of reminding you what's important." Julia led him on a tour of the facility, showing him the programs they had implemented to support the children's education and well-being. Edward listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights from his years managing the family's philanthropic initiatives. When they reached the end of the tour, Edward gestured to a quiet corner of the garden. "Shall we sit for a moment?" Julia nodded, curious about what he had to say. They settled onto a weathered bench beneath a tree, the sound of children's laughter drifting through the air. "I've been thinking a lot about Scarlett," Edward began, his voice heavy with emotion, "about how much she loved helping others. She had this way of seeing the good in everyone, no matter their circumstances." Julia smiled faintly. "She sounds incredible. I wish I could have known her." "You remind me of her," Edward said, his gaze steady. "Your kindness, your determination. It's like having a piece of her back." Julia's throat tightened, but she managed a quiet, "Thank you," Edward continued, his tone resolute. "I want to honor Scarlett's memory, and I can't think of a better way than supporting the work you're doing here. I'd like to create a foundation in her name, something that ensures children like these have the resources they need to thrive." Julia's eyes widened, her heart swelling with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Edward, that's incredible. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help me make it happen," Edward said with a smile. "This isn't just about honoring Scarlett. It's about building a legacy we can both be proud of." Julia nodded, her voice firm. "I'd be honored." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning and collaboration. Edward and Julia worked tirelessly to establish the Scarlett Sullivan Foundation, pooling their skills and resources to create something that would make a lasting impact. The foundation's mission was simple yet profound: to provide education, healthcare, and support to children in need, ensuring they had the tools to build brighter futures. As the launch approached, Julia found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The pain and confusion of discovering her true identity had given way to a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was capable of. And through it all, Edward had been by her side, not just as a father, but as a partner in this shared vision. On the day of the foundation's opening gala, Julia stood on the stage, her heart pounding as she faced a room filled with supporters and donors. Edward stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Taking a deep breath, Julia began her speech. "This foundation is not just a tribute to Scarlett Sullivan, but a testament to the power of hope and resilience. It's a reminder that no matter how difficult the past may be, we have the ability to shape the future." The applause that followed was thunderous, and as Julia looked out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of pride. Scarlett's memory would live on, not just in the hearts of her family, but in the lives of countless children who would benefit from the foundation's work. And for the first time, Julia felt truly at peace with her place in the world. The Scarlett Sullivan Foundation quickly became more than a vision. It was a movement. Within weeks of its launch, the foundation's work began to make waves. Stories of children receiving life-saving medical care, families finding stability, and communities growing stronger began to emerge, each one a testament to what Julia and Edward had set out to achieve. Julia threw herself into the foundation's daily operations, balancing her work as a nurse with her new responsibilities. The long hours and relentless demands were exhausting, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. One evening, as Julia finished a meeting with the foundation's board, she returned to her small office to find Edward waiting for her. He leaned against her desk, holding a folder and wearing a rare, relaxed smile. "I wanted to share something with you," he said, handing her the folder. Inside were letters, handwritten notes from children and families who had been impacted by the foundation's work. Julia's eyes scanned the pages, her heart swelling with emotion at their words of gratitude and hope. "This is incredible," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined we could make such a difference so quickly." Edward's smile widened. "It's because of you, Julia. Your passion, your drive. It's inspired all of us." Julia shook her head, her cheeks flushing. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Edward's tone softened. "Maybe not, but it's your heart that keeps this alive." As the foundation grew, Julia found herself reconnecting with her past in unexpected ways. One day, while visiting a new shelter funded by the foundation, she recognized a familiar face among the staff, Mrs. Callahan. The older woman's eyes widened in surprise as Julia approached. "Julia, is that really you?" Julia smiled warmly. "It's me. I can't believe you're here." Mrs. Callahan returned the smile, though her expression quickly turned serious. "I heard about the foundation and about Scarlett. I'm so sorry for everything that happened." Julia shook her head. "You don't have to apologize. You did what you thought was right, and because of you, Scarlett was loved and cared for, even if only for a short time." Tears welled in Mrs. Callahan's eyes. "You're just like her, you know? Strong, kind, determined. She would have been so proud of you." Julia's throat tightened, but she managed a soft, "Thank you." The encounter left Julia feeling more connected to Scarlett than ever. Through Mrs. Callahan's stories, she began to piece together the sister she had never known. A vibrant, fearless child who had left an indelible mark on everyone she met. Back at the foundation's headquarters, Edward called Julia into his office one afternoon with an unexpected announcement. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone measured, "about the future of the foundation and about you." Julia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What about me?" Edward leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You've proven that you have the heart and the vision to lead this organization. I think it's time I step back and let you take the reins." Julia's eyes widened. "Edward, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "And you should. This foundation is as much yours as it is mine, if not more. I've spent years running businesses, but this is different. It needs someone who can connect with people on a personal level. Someone like you." Julia hesitated, her mind racing. The thought of leading the foundation was daunting, but Edward's faith in her was undeniable. "I'll need your guidance," she said finally. "You'll have it," Edward promised. "But this is your time, Julia. I believe in you." In the months that followed, Julia embraced her new role with determination and grace. She worked tirelessly to expand the foundation's reach, partnering with other organizations and launching new initiatives that addressed the root causes of poverty and inequality. Edward, true to his word, stepped into a supporting role, offering advice and encouragement when needed, but allowing Julia to take the lead. Watching her thrive filled him with a pride he hadn't felt in years, a sense that he was finally doing right by his family's legacy. One evening, as Julia prepared for a speaking engagement at a charity gala, she paused in front of a mirror, adjusting the delicate flower-shaped locket Edward had given her. She opened it briefly, her gaze lingering on the photo of Scarlett inside. "I hope I'm making you proud," she whispered. At the gala, Julia took the stage to a standing ovation. Her speech was heartfelt and powerful, a call to action that left the audience inspired and motivated when she stepped down. Edward was waiting in the wings, his eyes shining with pride. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into a hug. Julia smiled. "Thank you for everything." Edward's voice softened. "You're everything I could have hoped for in a daughter, Julia, and I know Scarlett would feel the same." Tears filled Julia's eyes, but she held her head high. The pain of the past would always be with her, but it no longer defined her. She had found her purpose, her family, and her place in the world. And as she looked out at the crowd, she knew that Scarlett's legacy would live on, not just in the foundation, but in every life they touched. Months turned into a year, and the Scarlett Sullivan Foundation became a beacon of hope for communities in need. Its work reached across cities and borders, providing education, healthcare, and support to those who had been overlooked. Julia's leadership proved transformative, earning her respect and admiration from colleagues, beneficiaries, and even the media. But beyond the accolades, what truly mattered to Julia were the stories. Children finding safety, families rebuilding their lives, and individuals daring to dream again. Every success reminded her of Scarlett, whose short life had sparked a legacy far greater than anyone could have imagined. One sunny afternoon, Julia sat in the Foundation's main office, reviewing proposals for a new program that aimed to bring mental health resources to underserved areas. Her desk was cluttered with papers, but she didn't mind the chaos. It was a reflection of the work she loved. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Looking up, she saw Edward standing there, holding a small wrapped package. "Got a minute?" he asked with a smile. "Always," Julia replied, gesturing for him to come in. Edward placed the package on her desk, his expression tinged with excitement. "This is for you, something I came across recently while going through some old belongings." Julia raised an eyebrow. Curious, she carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn but sturdy, and inside, the pages were filled with delicate handwriting. "This was Scarlett's," Edward explained. "She loved to draw and write little stories. I thought you might like to have it." Julia's breath hitched as she flipped through the pages. Each drawing and note felt like a glimpse into Scarlett's world, a window into the sister she had never met, but now felt deeply connected to. "Edward, this is incredible," Julia said, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done so much to honor her memory." "Julia, I know she'd be proud of the person you've become." Julia nodded, her heart full. "I'll make sure her stories live on, just like her legacy." The journal inspired Julia to start a new initiative within the Foundation, a creative arts program for children. The idea was simple, but powerful, giving kids the tools to express themselves through art, writing, and storytelling. She named it Scarlett's Stories, and the program quickly became one of the Foundation's most beloved projects. Through Scarlett's Stories, Julia saw children's imaginations come to life in ways that mirrored Scarlett's own drawings. It was as if her sister's spirit was alive in the laughter and creativity of the kids who participated. One evening, after a long day at the Foundation, Julia found herself walking through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, the air warm with the promise of summer. She thought about how far she had come, from a nurse struggling to make ends meet, to discovering her true identity, to leading an organization that was changing lives. The journey had been anything but easy, but it had shaped her into someone she was proud to be. Stopping by a park, Julia sat on a bench, gazing at the children playing nearby. She opened the locket around her neck, letting her fingers trace Scarlett's photo. "Thank you," she whispered softly, the words carrying a mix of love and gratitude. The next morning, Julia stood in front of the staff at the Foundation's headquarters, delivering a speech that marked the organization's second anniversary. Her words were filled with hope and reflection, a testament to the power of resilience and unity. 2 years ago, this foundation was just an idea, she said. Today, it's a force for good, driven by the belief that everyone deserves a chance to thrive. This is not just Scarlett's legacy. It's ours. Together, we're proving that even in the face of loss and hardship, we can create something beautiful. The room erupted in applause, and as Julia stepped down from the podium, she felt a wave of fulfillment wash over her. Edward approached, his pride evident in his smile. "You've built something extraordinary, Julia. Scarlett's legacy couldn't be in better hands." Julia looked at him, her heart swelling. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Thank you for believing in me." Edward's voice softened. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope." As the event wound down, Julia took a moment to herself, standing by a large window overlooking the city. The twinkling lights reminded her of the stars, vast and full of promise. Her journey was far from over, but she knew she wasn't alone. Scarlett's memory, Edward's unwavering support, and the lives she had touched would continue to guide her. For the first time, Julia felt truly at peace, not just with her past, but with the future she was building. And as she walked back into the room to rejoin the celebration, she carried with her the certainty that Scarlett's legacy would endure, shining brightly for generations to come.